Good evening. Firstly, I'd like to thank ERAS, the committee, and Hull University for organising these webinar events and these presentations, and also for inviting me to contribute. I'm really looking forward to this. For the next half an hour or so, I wanted to discuss the Humberside Discovery Programme, HDP, and how it's been coming together for the last year. Some of you may remember back in September 2019 that I presented at the ERAS Forum and discussed how the HTP had come together and what we were looking to do over the next year and 18 months from that point. As you can imagine, that's drastically changed. So I'd like to kind of summarise what we have done in the last 12 to 13 months, and also some of the possibilities that that has generated for us going forwards that weren't necessarily on our radar a year ago. And also some of the frustrations that we've had over the last 6 to 9 months as well. What I also wanted to present, and what is a large part of today's presentation, is some of the research that I've conducted over the last 9 months, which is part of a longer research project in my personal research project for over the last 5 or so years. And that's about some of the lithics of the Humber and the Lincolnshire and East Riding region. And I'll go into that as the second part. I'll also then just briefly introduce some of the ideas that you can come and join us over the next few months and going forwards in various ways, virtually and in person, to try and continue the project going forwards and also potentially to add to ERAS's future as well. So I'm going to switch onto my my screens now, my presentation. And as you'll already know, there is a Q&A at the end, so any questions I'm happy to take at the end. And I've also got my email address and my Twitter details. So as I say, I hope you enjoy today's presentation. Shouldn't be going on for too long, just to give a broad understanding. I'll give that quick update and recap of where we are and what we're coming from. That I did do this time last year. I'll also discuss our low tide trails because they have come on quite a bit, and you can get hold of those now through the website. And I'll give you a little bit more information about those and some that we might be running in the coming months, weather and situation dependent. A recap on the year of 2020, or really 2029, the end of it, and 2020, what we've been able to do, the successes, and obviously I'll just mention a few of the things that we've had to cancel. And then onto that research that I was discussing just a second ago, and discuss how the lithics on the Humber and some of the work I've been pulling together over the past 6 months as part of that. Just very briefly, this is the outline that was the same slides I used last year. So the text on the right-hand side here explains what the basis of the project was when we set out to start to run the Humberside Discovery Programme as part of Citizan. And you can see on the map there all the places that are of general interest, but obviously we're also working in between all of those. For example, I'm in Griffiths next week, often on Flamborough Head. So obviously the sad bits of this year for the project specifically is cancelling all these events in the Humberside area for obvious reasons. So again, this is the exact slides I put up last year, and none of these have gone ahead apart from some continued work within Cleethorpes itself. We were actually able to run a face-to-face walk back at the very end of the summer holidays, and we are hoping still to go out there next week as part of the Festival of Archaeology to do a couple of the family bubble walks on the beach, and to really do some of our more community engagement work. But none of the other ones there have actually gone any further into any fruition. However, we have been able to put up a number of our low tide trails online, so they are self-guided versions of walks that we have run in the past. And you can get hold of these through the website. You can just see the clip on the left-hand side there, so everybody's available to get hold of those. And I did say this last year, but this is part of the England Coast Path, which is supposed to have been completed this year, but for obvious reasons I don't think it's going to be. I haven't heard from them more directly about that. But our low tide trails are continuing to be uploaded online and also made available. And as I say, we are also running the odd small socially distanced event as well. And these have included a series of virtual low tide trails, mainly running through platforms such as Twitter, or nearly exclusively Twitter, and running live on time, normally on a Friday morning. And they've seemed to have gone down particularly well with a lot of our audiences. We also run a Southern webinar series, so very similar to what you guys are doing here for the winter, really showcasing various bits of research in our 2 Southern Discovery Programme areas. And this is something that we're looking to expand to do a winter series across the country, so looking at all of our discovery zones and places in between as well, looking at researchers that are working on coastal intertidal zone archaeological network material. I've particularly been interested over the last 6 to 9 months in running something called Skype for Scientists sessions. And this is where teachers and scientists you sign up online and you're matched based on the topics and timings that you can put forward to do some online teaching. And I think it's filled a very important role, both for an outreach perspective as an archaeologist, but also as a teaching perspective for various teachers across the world. I've also run one session in Hull online through Zoom, which I'm also backing up this year and hoping to do a couple more before Christmas comes around. And that's something that I'm looking to build on a little bit more in the more focused regional area of Humber. And then we also had a really successful outreach initiative run down in the south, but countrywide, called Crafting with Citizan. It went particularly down well, particularly during the first 3 months of severe lockdown, if you like, providing an online medium for engaging with children over a series of months. And some of that will be going live again next week as part of the Festival for Archaeology. That leads me on to discussing the research element that I was talking about at the beginning. And just to give a quick background, some of this is the material that I've been looking at for around about 4 to 5 years, associated with initially Lincolnshire, but then Lincolnshire and Yorkshire as I've moved around. And as part of the Humberside Discovery Programme, then I focused it a lot on the material that is obviously close to the coast as well. But I will just give a quick background into where this data and ideas come from. So first of all, the baseline data, if you like, for want of a better term, has come from 2 main sources. That's my Humber sites that I describe here are actually part of the Humber Wetlands project, and data taken from that material just directly from the publications. And then the Wymer material is actually part of, which may be less familiar to people, is part of the English Rivers Paleolithic Survey, which was undertaken in by the mid-90s. The main gazetteer was published in 1999. This material here, which is Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, wasn't really included within that final publication, which is why I thought it was of interest to have a look into. And I managed to you can get hold of the full data set, and anybody can, through DADS. And the standout bits from this database that are nationally significant are firstly places like Risby Warren, where there's actually 2 sites, or 2 hand axes specifically found in this area. I'll discuss a little bit more about Risby Warren as that fits into that Humberside area, so it kind of connects with the current research I'm doing as well. Then there's the Lincolnshire gravel quarries, specifically around the Lincoln area. These were part of the Proto-Trent. A lot of work has gone into these over the last 5 or 6 years, a little bit longer, as part of the Quaternary Trent project, which was published in 2014. So a lot of that work has been now re-looked at, and excellent new databases for there. Another highlight is the Funa Valley, which a lot of you will know about through Peter Halkin's work. I know he discussed it last year when we were at the ERAS forum in September, but elsewhere as well. And I bring some of that into what I'll discuss later in this session today. So to give a little bit more of a focused viewpoint from what the material I've specifically been interested in. So we've got that Funa Valley again, you can see on the far left-hand side. We've also got these two sites north and south of the Humber, which have a kind of similar outlook to them. First at Kirmington, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail in a minute. Some of the material I've been looking at directly from this site. And then there's the Burswick Caingham quarries, which some of you may be very familiar with, obviously in East Yorkshire, which seems to have a similar connection between how the deposits that they're coming into or coming out of, and also the material involved, although well, I'll explain a little bit more why that's quite simplistic to say in a second. There's also this material up at Flamborough Head, which includes a hand axe that is just being published with ERAS and also the Yorkshire Archaeological Society from Danes Dyke, which I'll show a little bit more of today for those who haven't already seen the newsletter. And I'll discuss a little bit more how that fits into this wider, small but potentially really significant or interesting find area around the circle that I put on there. So not just Flamborough Head, but kind of a focus, I've been calling it Flamborough Head. To add a bit more detail then, if I move on to Kirmington, one of the sites that I've just been discussing very briefly there. This is a site that was originally discovered or found back in the 20s and 30s. And it's of interest specifically here because it holds, or is said to hold, over 70 artifacts that are supposed to have come from this site. It was from gravel extraction, and there's little known about exactly how that gravel extraction was undertaken over many years, and that's something I'll discuss a little bit more towards the end of the presentation today. But really hasn't seen much publication and much detail since those original discoveries and chats throughout the 30s, really, not just this 1931 paper that I presented here. It was found within this system commonly or colloquially known as the Kirmington Fjord, which I'll show a section through in a second, and it shows a series of these deposits overlain, well, ultimately overlain by a glacial till of lasting to glacial, but also has an estuarine shingle bed and an estuarine mud mud deposit within it as well. Also said by Burchell, which is why it becomes quite interesting for us in trying to understand the earlier parts of the Humber discovery area and the coastal areas around it and the occupation of humans during this period. To give a little bit more of a background context, as I said at the beginning, this is part of some research I've been kind of pulling together for the last 4 to 5 years or so. And it started as part of some work I was doing for the Bishop of Gloucester University in Lincoln, running there and teaching their Paleolithic elements for their undergrads. One of the sessions that I used to run is a handling session, handling a series of artifacts from the collection in downtown in Lincoln. And it came to this year when I was running, just before lockdown, actually a couple of the artifacts that came up from the museum for me to present to the students were actually assigned to being from this site at Kirmington. Now, before this, I hadn't really looked into where they might be. There were said to be some in the collection, said to be some in the BM, and said to be some in a collection in Cambridge that, again, I haven't looked into. However, these two artifacts, which you can see in these images here, are clearly both assigned to this Kirmington cannon shot gravel, which I'll explain slightly more in a minute. And you can see the ones on the left-hand side show clear bulbar percussion marks as large flake implements, or at least 10 centimeters big. You can also see they're extremely heavily eroded and battered, and that's essentially not surprising as they've come from this cannon shot gravel that Burchell describes as a high energy estuarine gravel system. And to move on to the more recent work I've been able to do just after lockdown, well, back in September, I went to the North Lincolnshire Museum and managed to locate a series of more of these artifacts, at least 10 some of which are, I'm pretty sure, aren't artifacts. They're just this roughly cannon shot gravel material coming out of that system. I've just been picked up thinking they were. But then there's other artifacts like the one on the right hand side here, which is in a relatively fresh condition. And if you zoomed in onto the writing, which I haven't presented today, it actually says estuarine shingle rather than this cannon shot gravel. So there's clearly something going on within this site that could be of interest to us trying to understand these early hominid movements around the region. There's also a series of other artifacts at North Lincolnshire Museum, which really drove me to look into some of those as well, which I won't discuss in too much detail today, but it included the Risby Warren hand axe, which isn't this example, but and then this hand axe as well, which is very rarely discussed from a site called, or a village called Flixborough. So there's clearly a lot more going on in this region, specifically in northern part of Lincolnshire, that could feed into an understanding of this wider early landscape use. To start to give that chronostratigraphic view then, I've mentioned a number of times that these are Pleistocene deposits. It's from a Paleolithic archaeological assemblage. And you can really see this on this stratigraphic section here, the diagrammatic sketch of Birchill, so from that publication that I was showing at the beginning there. And you can see on the right-hand side how the majority of this infilled Kermington Fjord system is filled with boulder clays and gravel that you would associate with the last glacial maximum. The only thing that drives a kind of like a question mark with that assertion is that you can also see on top of it, it's got a cannon shot gravel, which is almost certainly of a beach gravel type, so pre-Holocene. And then you've also got a series of estuarine silts and estuarine warp and peat, as described by Birchill as well, infilling on either side of that cannon shot gravel. And then that's finally topped with another boulder clay, the brown boulder clay. Now, what this seems to suggest is actually what we've got is an earlier sequence below the last glacial till, with then a series of different landscape associated deposits of some kind of coastal system. Now, for those who know Kermington is approximately 10 to 15 miles inland, and so it's almost certain that these deposits that lie on top of that lower boulder clay have been pushed up probably by the last glacial maximum till. They've been pushed up that valley and now sit out of situ, but they do seem to have artifacts within them, hence why they why so interesting as part of this research, trying to look at the earlier landscapes of Humberside. So to give that some more of a context in a chronostratigraphical setting, this here, so many of you will be familiar with, represents the sea level and by proxy temperature, although they aren't directly tieable, for the last 500,000 years. So going through the later part of the Middle Pleistocene and into the Late Pleistocene. And you can see the dips and troughs on this specific graph, the way I've displayed it. The lower points there are when sea level is at its lowest. So you can see it drops to nearly 140 meters below sea level. That's what the left-hand axis represents. And then you can see that spreading back the last 500,000 years, as represented on the bottom. Just to kind of highlight that in more detail then. So we've got the last glacial maximum, which is what I believe and what is almost certainly what that brown till at Kermington represents. And we see it across East Yorkshire on the East Yorkshire coastline and also on the Lincolnshire coastline to a lesser extent and in through the Humber as well. So that will be around about 25,000 years ago, all the way through to about 13,000 years ago when that deposit is being put down. The last point, we know that the sea level was high enough to produce beaches similar to what we have today and estuarine systems, close enough to the likes of Kermington to have been represented by this Kermington deposit, is MIS 5E, so around about 125,000 years ago. Now, what we know about 125,000 years ago is actually this period in time, humans don't get across into Britain quick enough based on the sea level rise. So we're not actually seeing an archaeological record for this period until slightly later. In that case, what Kermington represents is something completely different. If it is associated with the estuarine system, then it has to have been one of these higher peaks prior to MAS 5e. And that provides a really interesting way to start to discuss this and where it could fit into a wider British understanding of hominid occupation and during these periods. And that's something that I'm hoping to develop on over the next few years, but at the current time, isn't really possible to get those dating systems in place for Kermington, which is what we needed. Keyingham then represents a little bit more of an enigma. Firstly, I haven't put anywhere near the detail and background into this site. It's only one that's been on my radar, but I've started to look into it recently with its connection to the Humberside region in general. So it is really a next one on the list for me alongside Kermington. What has been said about Keyingham, and again, it's another one where I haven't been able to locate the hand axes themselves, or the artifacts, is that the hand axes themselves are of MAS 3 age. Now that makes it interesting for me and of potential interest for the region as a whole, because that would connect it to that site at Risby Warren, where the artifacts are almost certainly somewhere between 60 and 30,000 years ago. Now, to give that a little bit of context and a little bit of background, and for those who already have figured this out, I guess, is that this is directly connecting it to the landscapes of Doggerland, more famously known, obviously, for its later prehistoric archaeological work, but also still well versed in understanding, specifically in the southern area of the North Sea, how this large landscape is being occupied by humans, in this context Neanderthals, over multiple generations and seemingly multiple occupational periods. Back to Keyingham, though, there's very little known about their context, and from the map you can see here how the actual find locations are even unclear between the two different projects that run during the early 90s, and why that is unknown. So whether they are coming from the gravel extraction, which would be easier to find because obviously you'd see those gravel pits, or whether they're coming from associated smaller gravel extractions, local, even just lime works, is unknown. Again, these were found and published, or at least announced during something like the 1910s. What has been said and what is often quoted is that they're from a riverine source. Now, this is of interest because this area is mostly of glacial till deposits, so similar to that, well, very similar to that brown till that we saw at the top of the Kermington sequence. But it also does have a series of these gravel hill deposits, which could indeed be riverine in source and have been proven to be so in certain places. But some of them show evidence of actually being glacial outwash gravels. So as the glacier's retreating north, these outwash gravels are flooding out of the southern edge of it. If they are riverine, however, it would be extremely interesting to see if we could tie them into places like the Proto-Funa that I've discussed already, or an earlier version of a Proto-Humber, and whether those things actually combine together to become a better understanding of this landscape and how far that stretches out into the North Sea itself and onto this landscape that we know more colloquially as Doggerland. All for the future. To get that back into a couple of other sites, so I want to just mention the Proto-Funa again, because it's quite interesting in how this ties to a better known site, Weltonley Wold, where you have faunal assemblages alongside artifacts. So you're seeing these hand axes together at the same time as the fauna being in the same landscapes, which is obviously of importance for understanding these occupational the hominid occupations of these areas at the time. And looking into more on the dating of these two would be particularly of interest going forwards as part of this wider understanding of hominid occupations in this region during the last part, or the later part of the Middle Pleistocene and into the Late Pleistocene. Now, potentially of more interest to those in the audience is the new announcement and publication with ERAS recently of the possible Paleolithic hand axe from the Danes Dyke. Now, I'll say first that the possible comes from the fact that myself and the finder of the artifact, Richard Myerscough, are slightly confused at where this artifact can be coming from, because there are no known deposits that could be associated with this earlier form of artifact. To give some backing behind that, it's more colloquially and commonly known as an Acheulean hand axe and would date to a period well within the Middle Pleistocene. Back on, I've got the chronostratigraphic map to come back up again in a minute to put that back into focus. However, it's an extremely well made and interesting artifact, and it comes from the Danes Dyke, and I'll show a little bit more context of the Danes Dyke itself in a second, or just actually slightly outside to the eastern side of Danes Dyke. But it's associated in a landscape backing with these other three individual lithic artifact sites, one at Rudston and one at East Huntow, which are both said to be hand axes. East Huntow, I think, is at the York Museum and could indeed be viewed at some point in the near future. The Rudston one is another example of an artifact that I haven't been able to find. The Subi Steps material or single artifact is actually a Levallois core, and is one I'd be particularly interested in finding, because it could be indeed associated with this Paleolithic hand axe, very close together, but it's more likely to be of a slightly different age, and that would be interesting to try and depick. And again, this is going back to the idea that, as far as we know, there are no deposits on Flamborough Head or even close by that could be producing this material. However, we do have this background, very low noise background level of quite old Pleistocene artifacts for in comparison to old in context of where they are in the northern part of Britain. Now, just to highlight that the Subi Cliff example there, the faunal find spot, is actually part of that MIS 5E raised beach that goes from Subi right the way to Hessel, across East Yorkshire. And that's of interest. So remembering what I was discussing before, the MIS 5E wasn't occupied by humans, but at Subi Cliff we find or there was found a good collection of faunal material, larger megafaunal material, including hippo. But it's obviously extremely unlikely, as we don't see that associated with humans anywhere else in Britain, that's where these artifacts are coming from. But that's the only other Pleistocene deposit we know of this early age that could be associated. Now, just to give a little bit of a more localized context for those who know Flamborough, as I say, it was the artifact itself, discovered by Richard, was actually found in a field to the east of the Danes Dyke. We took a trip out there back in August, September time, just to have a quick look at the field and discuss a few of the other prehistoric sites in the area. And you can see the field on the left-hand side was actually an oat crop at the time. Hopefully it's been ploughed now, but we haven't been able to get back, unfortunately, to ascertain maybe if there is something odd going on in the area deposit-wise. One thing to mention that behind, if you just on the right-hand side, if you go and find the post-1950 OS maps, there is actually a gravel quarry to about 10 to 15 meters, or maybe a little bit more, to the north of this find location. And it's my hunch that potentially that's what's disturbed some kind of deposit of an earlier period. Indeed, it could even be those gravels themselves. The rest of the area, as I'm sure most of you will know, is last glacial till deposits, apart from those MIS 5E beach deposits, of which there is one at Danes Dyke itself, on the beach itself there. So they're the only other Pleistocene deposits that we see that can't be ascertained to being modern Holocene. So to go back, as I did with the Kermington material, and try and give this a little bit of significance for why I'm discussing it today. And we really have to look at the wider understanding from a European perspective of the Neanderthal world, or the hominid world specifically, over the last 500,000 years, most of which is occupied by Neanderthals in Europe. You can see from this quite simplistic map how few hominid skull fossils we find from any material, in fact, any skeletal material we find across the whole of Europe for the period that I've been discussing, the past 500,000 years. Some of these spots are a little bit older, I must admit. Now, to begin to discuss that in a little bit more of an archaeological context, or a strictly lithic context, there are a number of more sites that we could put onto this map. But actually understanding the more northerly ones that are low-level scatters could be quite interesting, trying to understand the expansion of the species involved, and trying to look at how where potential sites might be coming up, both skeletally and lithic based as well, and not ignoring one from the other. Tentative model of this occupation of Britain at this time and these more northerly latitudes is one that is quite familiar to those who look at this period, and that is of a highly mobile hominid occupation, in this case almost certainly Neanderthals, and also of movement between lowlands and uplands. We have this lovely connection between Flamborough Head and the Yorkshire Wolds, and right the way down onto what would have been seen as Doggerland, or the North Sea Plain, if you like, during various points within the interglacial glacial cycle. We also seem to have a very interesting, and also seen elsewhere, connection with these river valleys and coastlines, so estuarine environments that we see at Kermington, but also the potential riverine environments at Keyingham could also be telling us something a little bit different about how these hominids are exploiting their landscapes, these earlier landscapes. And one thing that I didn't go into today, but it's something that me and Richard are hopefully going to look into, is the use of from across both the East Riding and the Lincolnshire Wold region, which is where most of this flint was probably more easily accessible, but also across the North Sea Basin, where we seem to be seeing the access of material coming onto modern land, so coming onto what is now terrestrial land, and we see it at places like the East Huntow Hand Axe. To briefly summarise that piece of work, and there is more detail in the references here, it's really looking at trying to understand if we can develop a bit of a better understanding of a deeper Humberside area and a deeper Humber occupation from hominids prior to certainly the last glacial maximum, and how we can fit that into a wider understanding of the British record, and indeed the more European record of northern expansion, and occupation of more northern latitudes by hominids. Now, I want to obviously go back to Humberside Discovery Programme, and quickly remind you, if you are interested in joining us at any point in the future, then I encourage you to sign up to our newsletters and our social media posts. And just quickly to obviously acknowledge our funders and project partners. Firstly, the Heritage Fund, but also Lloyd's Register Foundation, the Museum of London Archaeology, the CBA, and the Nautical Archaeological Society, who are our partners in our various regions, and then the various other supporters that we have for this project that we can see on there as well, and numerous others that are unmentioned. I'll now take off my screen, and hopefully we'll be able to connect via or direct link for questions, and do feel free to send them through at any point.